episode of CrimeWar podcast. And as we have such a great network of journalists covering the crime beat around the world, it's great to talk to Keegan Hamilton, a reporter for Vice, who I met at the Chapo trial in January last year. Is it as long ago as that? Wow.
God, yeah, January 2019, an eternity ago.
2019, and we met there. He was doing great coverage. He really was on top of that trial, and we were also hanging out at the party with Team Chapo, with the mariachis hired by the Chapo lawyers, which is quite a surreal scene there. But yeah, it's great to see follow Keegan's work on organized crime from the US side and globally, and a lot of issues, very important issues on the US side. And he's been kicking ass this year. You had his investigation on John Oliver. Congratulations for that.
Thank you. John Oliver got interested in the COVID in prisons and picked that up.
Yeah. So COVID-19 going through the US prison system and talk about that. And just launching this podcast, which you've been working on for a year, on the opioid fentanyl epidemic in the US. Very important issue. One of these issues has kind of been forgotten with all of the coverage of COVID and protests, and there's other issues, but a really important issue. And, with that. So first of all, talking about that and wondering this year, in terms of opioid problematic use, opioid deaths, what have you been seeing with the pandemic? Because I would think that a lot of people stuck inside, depressed, people dying of COVID, they'll be more vulnerable to opioid addiction and these kind of things. On the same side, you've got crazy stuff with the border being more heavily policed, and all of these things. So what have you been seeing, first of all, on the US side of deaths and use and selling of opioids?
Yeah, as you said, it's the coronavirus and the pandemic has sort of overshadowed all other public health concerns right now. But quietly, sort of in the shadows, the opioid crisis has worsened. As far as we can tell, with COVID, you sort of have this running daily dashboard with a death toll and hospitalizations. And one of the main problems is there's no sort of data transparency like that with opioids. The lag time on counting fatal overdoses, the official reporting from the CDC and the federal government is up to a year behind. But some of the groups that are doing more real-time monitoring of select counties have recorded rates of up to 20% more overdoses approximately.
Wow.
Than they were seeing before the stay-at-home orders. Of course, that's compounded by people being at home, using alone by themselves when they might be using with friends previously, and also just increased anxiety, depression, all of these factors that cause people to use drugs problematically are heightened in the pandemic. And there's been some sort of anecdotal reporting of addiction treatment centers, mental health treatment providers being overwhelmed with new patients since the pandemic started and all these stay-at-home orders took effect in March, and the economic collapse that has gone along with that. So yeah, drug use still happening. Drug overdoses appear to be going up, and it's a problem that's not going away. We talk about flattening the curve with COVID. The curve for overdoses has not been flattened. It's been going up steadily for a decade now.
I mean, it's a huge story, this, which needs some coverage, so it needs to kind of get through. An increase of 20%, and this is brings in all the angles of how you deal with the pandemic and the lockdown, and it's not easy stuff. It's complicated because it's depressing the threat of the virus coming, and also the pressures of the lockdown and all of these things. Do you have a sense of how easy it is to buy for regular Americans, people who buy opioids on the street?
Mm-hmm.
Has that been changed much? I mean, I was kind of wondering when there was the hard lockdown, if these kind of open air drug markets, for example, I don't know if in the Bay Area you have those in the Bay Area. I was kind of pretty amazed by how open they were in Baltimore, Maryland, when I was doing reporting there before. But like, have they still been operating, or has the lockdown affected those at all?
So the sort of lowest level street level opioid sales appear to be continuing uninterrupted at this point. I mean, I'm sort of confined to my own little narrow slice of the Bay Area in California, but anecdotally, I've heard across the Bay in San Francisco, in the Tenderloin and the sort of downtown San Francisco, where there are those open air drug markets, that's still happening. You see some dealers wearing surgical masks and gloves, but more or less business as usual. And the same thing in some of the rougher parts of Oakland. We did reporting there for our podcast, and our sources who we work with say, like, yeah, if I go out down the block, the dope boys are still posted up doing what they do. Where it gets a little more murky is slightly up the supply chain in terms of the more mid-level dealers and suppliers. I was, had done some reporting in Mexico that suggested that there were shortages of the precursor chemicals that you need to make fentanyl and to cook heroin and also to process meth. But it looks like that hasn't translated yet to any shortages on the supply chain. Like, some of the data coming from the US border shows that drug seizures have continued more or less at what they were before the COVID lockdown took effect. And if, because of the increased scrutiny, you'd think that they might even find more. But it seems like the prices of chemicals and the costs associated with making drugs have gone up slightly. But I don't think, at least in from what I've heard, that it's translated to an actual supply shortage yet.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. You get, shortages. There was shortages of toilet paper a while ago, but no shortage of opioids for people to get down on that. Yeah, in terms of the border, I mean, people are saying living by the border, it's much harder to cross into the United States right now. That even if you have a visa to go into the United States, they can still say no. During this pandemic, they can say no if it's not essential. We're not going to let you in. So you think the traffic will be reduced, and that'd be harder to then bring in through all the cars. But even so, you still have so many cars, and they still can only search a certain number. So I guess the logic is, if you look at Tijuana, for example, Tijuana, San Diego, still if they search, once you stop and make the bust, you can only make so many busts in a day. So
exactly,
you still have that trafficking mechanism. So getting on then to your podcast series, very timely, and really looking forward to listening right through this. How many episodes do you have in total?
It's not 9 episodes total.
Great. 9 episodes, and you go to China, you go to Mexico, Sinaloa, looking at the smuggling.
Yeah, we try to get the whole sweep of fentanyl. The history of the drug war, sort of the history of various opioid crises that preceded this in the United States, and then also track the supply chain from the chemicals in China. We did some reporting there in October before the pandemic happened. We were able to go to Wuhan, China, actually, which was surreal, looking at everything that happened afterwards and thinking we were right there before everything went crazy. But Wuhan was one of the hubs of the fentanyl trade in China. So we went there trying to locate some traffickers who were part of the story, and ended up meeting one Chinese fentanyl dealer in Shanghai to talk about sort of the online side of the business and his supply of chemicals to Mexican groups. That was one of the things that he'd sort of, as China has cracked down on fentanyl, the manufacturing in China has become more risky and difficult. And a lot of that has been outsourced to Mexico because it's more difficult to control these precursor chemicals, and the cartels can just make it themselves. So that was our next step, was going to Sinaloa, shadowing some Sinaloa cartel members as they imported the precursor chemicals, blended fentanyl into heroin, and then prepped those kilos to be smuggled across the border.
Now, just for some people who aren't really familiar with what fentanyl is, I mean, define fentanyl and define what is actually used or abused by drug users, particularly in the United States.
So it's a synthetic opioid, which means it's entirely man-made with chemicals in a lab, unlike heroin, morphine, which are derived from opium poppies, a plant. The advantage of fentanyl from a dealer's perspective and also from a user's perspective is very strong, about 50 times stronger than heroin. And it's been used for years in medicine in the United States for cancer pain, as a surgical anesthetic. Now, if somebody gets intubated for COVID, put on the ventilator, they get a dose of fentanyl typically. But what's causing all of this overdose deaths in the United States is illicit fentanyl, which is made black market labs in Mexico or China, and then cut into other drugs. Typically heroin, you can make a kilo of heroin stretch out into 3 or 4 or 5 kilos if you add fentanyl without losing any of the potency. And the problem then is that low-level dealers don't know exactly what they're selling. Users don't know exactly what they're taking, so you get unpredictable dosages and more easy overdoses.
And also what I'm hearing from drug users in the United States and in the UK and around the place is that now people are getting used to heroin with fentanyl, and if it doesn't have fentanyl, they're like, oh, this is no good anymore. I can't get my kick off this heroin anymore unless it has that boost of fentanyl.
Yeah, boosted is the term that people have used to talk about it, where if you do just fentanyl on its own, and I haven't done this myself, but what users are saying is it's a much shorter high. It doesn't last as long. You need to go back and for another dose multiple times in a day. Previously, with just heroin, with black tar heroin, for example, it's not as strong. It's more of like a warm, fuzzy blanket feeling is way people have described it. But when you combine those two, it's a longer lasting, more powerful high that it wasn't sought after initially. It was kind of forced on users, I think. But now that it's out there on the marketplace and people are used to it, like you're saying, that is regular heroin going to work anymore? You still find, in our reporting, we still found people who sought out pure black tar heroin or black tar heroin that was not cut with fentanyl just because they've been using that for years and preferred it. But I think it has weirdly, the supply has shaped demand in this case.
So, going to China, and this is great. For many years I've been looking at Mexico at, before it was crystal meth and all of the precursors for crystal meth coming over the Pacific, and then it was fentanyl. So it's great to have this link of reporting in China itself. Now, are you seeing the factories which are producing the precursors? I mean, first of all, what's coming out of China? Is it generally precursors, or is it actually fentanyl itself coming out of China and being taken to Mexico?
The short answer is both. It used to be in years past, maybe 3-4 years ago, that you were seeing a lot of very pure fentanyl being shipped directly from China to the United States through the mail system. Now, the US government raised a big stink about this. It got bad publicity for China, which doesn't like to be seen as a drug country. They have very strict drug laws. So starting in May of 2019, China passed sort of a blanket ban on fentanyl and fentanyl analogs manufacturing. It became a controlled substance. Since that has happened, seizures of fentanyl in the mail in the United States have gone down considerably. They're still finding it, but smaller quantities, not as frequently. Meanwhile, we're seeing more coming in high volumes from Mexico. That lower purity fentanyl, it's stuff that's been cut pretty substantially, less than 10% purity, whereas stuff that's coming through the mail could be over 90% pure. So what's coming to Mexico, I think, is predominantly precursor chemicals, but there is also reports from the DEA and others that they're getting pre-made fentanyl and then cutting it into heroin and meth and other drugs in Mexico. So
Now, in China, the people making this in China, they are like regular big pharmaceutical companies. This is not like clandestine operations. These are just big companies. Are they government-run companies or independent private companies, or what are they?
So there is some government sanctioned fentanyl production in China, but that's strictly for the medical market in China to supply hospitals. Really, the companies that are making illicit fentanyl are operate in sort of a legal gray area. At this point, if they are making fentanyl and other synthetic opioids, that's illegal, and they're trying to conceal what they're doing from the government. And the source that I communicated with knew what they were doing was illegal. We spoke only on the encrypted messaging app Signal. The person was very concerned about authorities in the U.S. and China getting on to them and coming to bust them, basically. But and as a result of that, this person claimed, and I'm skeptical about it, they've gotten out of the fentanyl business entirely and were just supplying chemicals and other synthetic drugs. So you would see these Chinese firms, they're all like biotech companies is how they market themselves. And they will sell everything under the sun: steroids, bath salts, synthetic cathinones, synthetic marijuana, growth hormone, all of these sort of border fringy substances that are in the gray area of the law, they sort of specialize in. But because China has put in more tight controls on fentanyl, that's become a dicier proposition for them. And it's a serious risk. China sentences major traffickers to death.
I mean, talking about China, how is it for you doing this? Did you ask the Chinese government permission and journalist visa, or was it kind of undercover? How difficult was it to report on this quite sensitive information, which the Chinese government is not particularly happy about? Yeah.
It is very sensitive, especially because of what we were just talking about with all the involved in Trump's trade war with China and the international political concerns. So when we tried to go to the Chinese government and approach their equivalent of the DEA, we got silence, crickets from them. We had better luck going to, we went to a pharmaceutical conference basically for the legal drug industry to see how massive the scale of this industry is. And it filled a convention center basically the size of a football stadium with every type of chemical and chemical product that you can imagine. So we could see there how difficult it was or is for the government to control this massive industry. And in some ways, the government has incentive to turn a blind eye to it because it is generating significant economic revenue for the country. One of the reasons that people theorize that Wuhan became such a key player, key hub in the fentanyl industry is because it already had a lot of low-grade chemical manufacturing for fertilizers and things of that nature, but it wasn't making quite enough money, and they saw the market value in this unregulated, highly sought-after opioid and turned to that sort of with tacit government approval.
Now, I mean, I was here in Mexico back at the Associated Press when the Shenli Yigun scandal broke right back then. And the Associated Press, he was interviewed by the Associated Press when I was there. So for people who don't know this case, this was a guy who was bringing in precursors for crystal meth. Back then, they found in his house $207 million in a house in Mexico City. A kind of crazy story. He was going to Vegas with suitcases full of money and laundering this through Vegas, basically. He gave this insane interview to the Associated Press and all this kind of crazy stuff. But this was a Chinese national who came to Mexico, was then naturalized a Mexican citizen, and he was making all his money, bringing his precursors and selling them to the Beltran Leyva faction that's in Lower Cartel, I believe. Now, are you finding that these same kind of, is there also Chinese billionaires or millionaires making money out of this, or is it now simply cartel affiliates, do you think, going to China, setting up these deals, doing it themselves? Do you have any idea who is importing this stuff to Mexico?
That's a great question. And I think that the sort of foundation that was put in place by traffickers like Ioan, who had the biggest pile of cash that anyone has ever seen in his home, really enabled the same types of relationships to happen now with fentanyl. Basically the source that we spoke to, who said that they had sold both like the technical specs to set up a fentanyl lab and the ingredients, never actually met face to face with the person that they were doing business with. That was entirely done over the internet on encrypted messaging. And that's been a game changer now, even from 10, 15 years ago, is you don't have to be in Mexico City having those face-to-face meetings. You can find that source of supply and not risk traveling. The trust is obviously an issue. Like, how do you decide? But there's been plenty of reporting about those deals happening incrementally, where they'll send a test package and build trust slowly over those sorts of relationships. And even the fellow from China who we interviewed, as we looked more at his organization, it became clear that catering to Spanish-speaking customers was part of what he did. He had other websites set up that were entirely in Spanish, listing chemicals that were not just fentanyl, for fentanyl, but also for steroids and things like that.
Right, so have especially and Sinaloa and Spanish up there, like especially. So now, I mean, I've seen these great scenes of you on a boat watching these packages of precursors being picked up. Now, the traditional way of smuggling stuff into Mexico, a lot of the time of precursors, is right through the ports, and you've obviously got big corruption in the ports, and you've got ways they can just, and also people don't know what this stuff is a lot of the time. A lot of kind of weird chemicals. It's hard to keep track of what these chemicals are. These weird names, bunch of letters. But you're looking at people who were like bringing this in, throwing it to sea. So was this stuff that was coming in off cargo ships from Asia and then thrown into the sea? And then is that how it came in? Because like obviously smuggling, they have the smuggling method where they bring cocaine and stuff up on little boats from South America and they're throwing it in, but they're doing that with stuff coming from Asia. So how's that working?
That's what we were told by sort of the local Sinaloa cartel boss who oversaw that smuggling operation, is that the material came on a larger cargo ship, and as it got close to the coast, the Pacific coast of Mexico, that was thrown overboard, sealed up in packages that could float, and then they were given a location by satellite phone to come out and fetch those chemicals. Mexico has put tighter controls on precursor chemicals. Obviously, as you said, corruption, huge issue in the ports, and it's tough to know what people are looking for. But we were told in that operation that we watched that it wasn't just fentanyl precursors that were being brought in. It was also meth, synthetic drug precursors as well, which Mexican officials have been aware of and looking for a long time now. So they have a good reason to not bring that in through the official port traffic and just offload that at sea, bring it ashore, and take it to the safe house as the most high probability way of getting that merchandise ashore.
And that's another big story as well that's kind of been missed is meth is still huge in the United States. It's still huge here in Mexico, making meth. There's still a lot of people using meth here, in fact, which is concerning here as well, about people really getting strung out on meth in Mexico, but also in the US. And that's another story which hasn't got enough coverage. Now, you went to the place where they're making heroin and mixing in the fentanyl in the heroin. How was the smell? How you enjoy being in the lab there?
Well, we were planning ahead for that and brought the full face respirators, but even then you could smell very ammonia, acetone smell, not pleasant. If folks watch the video that we made and see what this material looks like coming out of the actual pot, where it's just a brown sludge, if you have any desire at all to try heroin, this might dissuade you from doing it because it just looks disgusting. It's hard to imagine putting that into your veins. We were shocked to see that the cooks at this site were not wearing any real protective gear at all, just a plain balaclava ski mask type of thing. And I don't think they were either unaware or didn't care about the long-term lung effects of hunkering over a boiling pot of fentanyl and heroin for several hours.
Yeah, I mean, you get all kinds of. I mean, like in Colombia, you get a lot of people with funny injuries from working in. They get these burns from working in certain parts of the cocaine processing there, and I mean, yeah, people obviously working in meth get the scars, but it's certainly hazardous work. Well, I mean, talking about that, and you're saying, I mean, show drug users this stuff, and will it make them less likely to use it? I mean, I don't know.
No, it will. It certainly will not.
I mean, I think some people, when you explain to people who just take cocaine, for example, and people take cocaine at a party, and they think that's kind of fashionable or fun. But if you actually say, well, it's not just the cocaine you're taking, you don't know what kind of crap is in that cocaine, and what kind of just whatever it could be, just any kind of crap they can mix in with that shit. But that's dealing with the drug use. So talking about that, I mean, I grew up in the UK in the 1980s, early 1990s, with a lot of people using heroin around me. So I had friends who used heroin, and I had 4 people I knew who died of heroin overdoses. So I kind of understand a little bit, or quite a lot, why people or how they use it. But why do you think it is? And it's kind of discussion I've had a few times, and no one has really clear answers. Why is it that in America right now, there's so much use of opioids? I mean, why are so many Americans using this stuff at such high levels, despite very high deaths?
Yeah, I mean, that's the fundamental question at the heart of our podcast. We spent basically 9 episodes of our show trying to explain that very complicated answer to that question. I think it boils down to a few things. One of which is a lot of trauma, untreated trauma, intergenerational trauma. I think is a big one that we heard over and over. Untreated pain and anxiety and mental health conditions, where the easiest way for someone to medicate themselves is with an opioid. Whether that's a pill that they can get from someone's medicine cabinet, or a bag of dope that they can get off the street for $5. And then the other component is America's healthcare system is really broken. It's so difficult for people who fall into addiction to get the help they need to get out and the support they need to get out of that. And I've been thinking about it a lot recently as the pandemic has gotten worse and started to spiral out of control in the United States again, is a lot of the same inequalities and disparities that you see in the treatment of addiction are happening with the treatment of COVID. And it's why COVID-19 has been more deadly, disproportionately deadly in communities of color in the United States, is they don't have the same access to the healthcare system that people of privilege that do in this country. And I think that that's why there hasn't been an easy fix to this problem. It's not you can just throw money at addiction treatment and this problem will go away, or throw money at the DEA and enforcement, which we've seen has no impact whatsoever on supply. Is that for America to really deal with this is going to be a reckoning with bigger issues that are more systemic and that we need to think really deeply about as a country going forward. And I think now with COVID, with everything that's happened in the last 4 years, I think that the time is right for change. And certainly, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. If we keep doing this same thing over and over with opioids, whether it's painkillers, whether it's heroin, whether it's fentanyl, we're going to see overdoses and addiction. And we're seeing that now. We've seen it before.
I mean, I saw one number from the American Medical Association. They were estimating that 90% of problematic drug users who need help do not get it. I mean, 90%, which is incredible. So kind of the idea of, we really need to push out help social work or help with this to reduce the drug use there and the drug money here in Mexico. But also, I mean, does this speak to, do you think personally, this speaks to a kind of broader sense of kind of America being broken, or our modern society is being broken right now, that people kind of lose a lot of kind of basic sense of dignity and basic sense of kind of worth and mission in life has kind of been lost? Do you think there's a sense of that in why people, especially in these areas where, I know very lost kind of communities that don't have a sense? Do you think there's something bigger there, a bigger picture of kind of societal kind of breakdown?
Absolutely. I think it's reflective of deeper problems that America has in terms of racism and inequality. Race definitely plays a factor in this. America's drug laws were built on racism, and you see the disparities even today with fentanyl enforcement. I think the most recent stat available is something like 75% of people convicted on fentanyl charges in federal prison are Black or Hispanic.
Oh, really?
It's the same. In a lot of ways, we're repeating the same mistakes of the crack era with just a different white powder that people can talk with hyperbole about and spawn fear about. But explaining why people use and why people can't get the help they need, those are really difficult questions. And the question of why people use is going to be different for every person. I mean, there's some people just do it because it makes you feel good. You don't have any bigger problems. It's just a fun thing to do. Other people, it is, some sort of untreated pain, a coping mechanism for childhood trauma. There's all kinds of reasons, and that's why there's no one easy solution. It has to be more holistic and individualized, and done compassionately. And that's really what America struggles with, is treating drug users with compassion.
I mean, so talking about the imprisonment and the federal prison system, state prison system, I've been doing some great work as well about the spread of COVID in the prisons. I looked at this earlier. I was talking to a source I have in a federal prison in North Carolina early on in the pandemic, and he was contacting me talking about this issue, saying there's a lot of fear here, COVID's coming in. When I put this out, in fact, originally one of the replies I got on social media was, "Fuck you and your sources, children are going to die of COVID. Why do you care about prisoners?" Is that something you got kind of approaching this issue? It's like when you have a pandemic and everyone was really scared in the early days, and everyone, loads of people are going to die. It's like, why do we care about prisoners? Why do we care about criminals, drug dealers and murderers who are locked up? Why do we care about them? Is that something you got, and how did you respond to that?
Absolutely. Anytime you write about anything that happens in prisons, as conditions of prisoners, that's an attitude that comes up. I think in COVID, it's particularly short-sighted because prisons are going to be incubators that spread the virus to communities, to states, and around the country. We've seen that all over the United States right now. I haven't seen what the latest stats are, but at one point, like 8 of the 10 biggest COVID hotspots were correctional institutions in the United States.
Wow, yeah.
These are not, on one hand, you think about prisons as this place where everybody's there, they never leave. Who cares if they get it in their prison cells? But it doesn't work like that. Staff in particular, are constantly going in and out of these prisons. Yeah. And as long as the outbreaks continue to foster in prisons, they're going to happen around the communities. That's one part of it. And the second answer, of course, is that, these are human beings, and no matter what they did, they probably didn't get a death sentence. And that's what COVID-19 has become in some prisons, especially lower security prisons, where a lot of the people who are there are in for pretty minor crimes, whether that's nonviolent drug offenses, white collar crimes, things of that nature. People who are going to be out in a couple of years, or due to be out, or sooner. People who had their sentences coming up and died before they can complete them is the thing that I encountered. So, while it might be easy to think of them as a group that is getting what they deserve, I don't think anybody deserves that, and I think it is a problem that as long as COVID is in American prisons, COVID is going to be in America, and it's on us to solve that problem for everyone, including prisoners.
Yeah, and I mean, we both spent a lot of time in prisons, and you realize it's very different than the kind of images you have of these really scary environments. In fact, it's kind of really environments with a lot of pain, a lot of people. I mean, just one of the things that kind of you don't hear about or don't see in the films is that people will cry. Men in prisons will cry. Sometimes, like that kind of thing just kind of strikes you. There was, this Brazilian prisoner who talked about this guy who used to, like, whenever he'd hear people crying, he'd go in and beat them, and it was that kind of idea that you think about that vulnerability. But I mean, another thing is that a lot of the deaths in prison are high because a lot of people are sick in prison. A lot of people have health issues. There are a lot of older prisoners with health issues in there. Why do you think, or how did it play out that the authorities just let this thing explode in prisons, just didn't take basic measures and just let it, grow right through?
I think the root cause of it is overcrowding in American prisons. I mean, where this has been the worst is in low security prisons, minimum security prisons, where when people think of prisons, they have an image in their minds of a cell where two guys are in there with bars. But most American prisons, especially the lower ones, are very big, open dormitory style areas where you got 150, 200 guys who are in bunk beds in the same space with no doors on the cells. So when it's sort of the perfect environment for COVID to spread when you have that many people indoors in close quarters. So when it has gotten in there, there's just a complete inability to create distance between the inmates. There's just not enough room to space people out, and no willpower on the part of authorities to release enough people to create distance for those who they think need to stay inside.
So just to finish off then, I mean, this got picked up by John Oliver. Congratulations. Were you happy with that? I mean, John Oliver, you think he gives justice to reporting, and should he be paying reporters for stories? I mean, it kind of gives him a show, or what do you think about this kind of the whole model of John Oliver? I know a few journalists have had their stories picked up, and they're generally pretty happy. I mean, they get big publicity for their stories, but how do you think he gave justice in terms of interpreting your reporting and in terms of of how he treats reporters' work?
I think John Oliver does an excellent job, generally speaking, on his stories. He featured some of the reporting from a piece that I did with another reporter from the Marshall Project, but he that segment was drawing from all kinds of reporting on prisons across the country and synthesizing it into something that can reach a whole different audience. I mean, I wrote a story that's quite long, very heavy, describing the conditions in prisons. Not everyone's gonna read that whole story. But having a comedian be able to distill that down, sprinkle some jokes in to make the medicine go down smoother, I think it's important. And sure, I'll take some money from John Oliver if he wants to give it to me. But I'm happy that he is taking on heavy topics like COVID in prisons and getting the message out there to the public that people who are running our prison system need to be held accountable and do a better job.
Okay, so just last words then, last thoughts. Depressing issues with drug addiction, drug overdoses. There was this comparison used in the during the COVID pandemic of more people have died in it than Vietnam. I thought it was actually a bad comparison because they're very different things. The Vietnam War than a COVID pandemic. But also, I mean, if you want to look at that, then like in many years, more Americans have died of drug overdoses than Vietnam. And if you take 10, 20 years, it's been a huge amount of deaths from this. So you've got that on one side and still this, enormous prison system on the other side. Do you have any hopes, any optimism of improvement, like covering this? I get very weary sometimes covering the violence here in Mexico. It's like you cover this stuff for years. It gets no better. You want to try and feel that we have hope and can try to offer some kind of positive change with this stuff. But I feel the drug debate is still very kind of stuck. Do you feel with people questioning society, questioning big, deep things about society we could move forward in a more positive way, or are you more positive or pessimistic right now about all this?
I'm with you, Ioan, where I've been doing this for a long time and having not seen or only seen very gradual incremental improvements or one step forward, two steps back improvements. It's easy to be cynical about these things and think we're doomed. That being said, with opioid addiction and fentanyl, it has become a more prevalent thing in society and it's affected more people's lives. I think at this point in America, everyone has had a family member or someone they know who struggled with addiction in some way. And so that has forced people to change the way they think about it. And what used to be, we're just going to lock people up and hope this problem goes away. I don't think anybody, even police, thinks that that's going to work anymore. And everybody agrees that there needs to be more compassion, more scientific-based approaches to treatment. And it's going to happen gradually. It's going to happen slowly, but I think we're trending in the right direction. Our federal government at this point under the Trump administration has taken a more authoritarian and in a way going back to where we were in the 80s with the war on drugs. So I think what happens is going to be dictated a lot by what happens in the United States in November and what the American people decide they want their approach to drugs to be.
Okay, so plenty to talk about there and to follow this going forward. So, well, great chatting to you, Keegan. Check out the podcast series. Really looking forward to listening right through to that. Check out all of your work on Vice. Great name, Keegan. We already said, obviously, from the UK, Kevin Keegan is the that comes up. I don't know if I ever told you it was a kid from my school who was arrested going back to the early 1990s for robbing Kevin Keegan. he was imprisoned for that. As a note there, it always comes to mind when I think of Kevin Keegan, football legend. But anyway, great chatting to you, Keegan.
Thank you so much for having me.
And take care.
All right, cheers.